Hi, I'm Brian Zinchuk. I'm the editor and owner of Pipeline Online, and with me I have my co-host, Bronwyn Eyre.
Great to be here, Brian. Let's go.
So this is the inaugural edition, a fitting day being the inauguration day in the United States. Donald Trump just said that he's going to tariff the snot out of us. And we are doing our first episode of the Pipeline Online podcast. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Pipeline Online, it's Saskatchewan's energy news. It's been around for 3 years in this form. I used to be the editor of a newspaper called Pipeline News, which was a petroleum monthly newspaper. But guess what? Newspapers are all pretty much dying. Sven Mercury just shut down here last week. And this is the new way to go. I used to be a pipeliner. I used to be an excavator operator, but being a pipeliner is a good way to get divorced. So that's why I gave that up while my wife still loved me. And I've been doing journalism for most of the last 17 years now. And now we have Bronwyn Eyre. Bronwyn, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So up until the recent provincial election, I served in the provincial government with Premier Moe, and most recently as Minister of Justice, and before that, over 4 years as Energy Minister in Saskatchewan. So that's when our paths initially crossed, sometime around 2019.
Yeah, so Bronwyn has done a lot of the fighting against Ottawa on everything from the carbon tax to the clean fuel standard, which is a second carbon tax, to all the other things. She's been our point woman, so to speak, on those initiatives. So her background is stuff. She's been in the room as it happens. One of the things about doing a podcast I think is really important is that it allows a format that I do a lot of for Pipeline Online. I've been doing for a while. My usual interview is an hour to an hour and a half. I write stories, I like to say, that has more depth than everyone else. Other media do what I call the 7-paragraph story, which is who, what, when, where, why, how, 2 quotes, and they're out the door. I was interviewed recently for some news about the Mercury shutting down and whatnot. At a 10-minute interview, they used 1 sentence.
Yeah.
And that's typical for other media. And that's not what Pipeline Online is about. It's all about depth. And doing the podcast format will allow us to expand into the depth and have really meaningful conversations of people and not just sound bites.
Yeah, it's so important. I remember the first interview I did with you. It was certainly thorough. It was a quiz me on all the trunk arms of the Enbridge pipeline system, as I recall. It was good.
Yeah, it was,
Good initiation.
so for our first guest here, we've got Eric Cline on. I'm going to bring Eric on right now. So Eric Cline was I'll let him do his own introduction here, but I will say this. I've talked to people in the oil patch who own oil companies who wouldn't vote orange if you put a gun to their kid's head. And they have told me, and forgive me, Bronwyn, but they told me they thought Eric Cline was the best energy minister we ever had.
Okay.
So with that, Eric, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to be on your inaugural podcast. I'm from Saskatoon. I'm like a lot of people from a farming background, with my grandfather and great-grandfather homesteading near Saskatoon, Zelma. But I practiced law here for 12 years, and then I was in the legislature for 16 years as a member of the legislature. And during that time, I served 12 years in the provincial cabinet, including being responsible for health, finance. I delivered 5 budgets and brought in a new personal income tax system. And also, I was Minister of Industry and Resources for about 6 years, and Minister of Justice for a while. And we brought in a lot of incentives for business and tried to reform the oil and gas royalties and had some incentives for potash. And after that, I worked in the private sector, in the mining sector, in fact, for 12 years in Saskatoon. I was a vice president at K+S Potash, and since 2018, I've been self-employed. I have an arbitration practice, which is just me, and also I'm a professional fused glass artist, and I have a small business selling my art as well. And people think of me as a politician because I'm best known for that, but actually I was 30 years working in the private sector and 16 years in the legislature. So that tells you somewhat how old I am. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. And I've authored 2 books as well.
So on that note, I have here, this is what we're going to talk about. This is my footnoted copy of Squandered, Canada's Potash Legacy. This will be the principal talk about this. Now, I should have had my great big story written about this 9 months ago, and I apologize. I got through it so far. I actually finished it last night, but the end of it. And my story is about 4,500 words. I'm going to break it up into a few pieces, plus the interview we did before and this. And you might think, Brian, that's a little excessive, but the reality is that how often do we have an in-depth discussion about royalties in this province that anyone can name? So where I'm going with that is that, and this is really important because while we be talking primarily about potash here, it also impacts oil royalties because in that regard, the royalty structure that Mr. Cline brought in here is the one that Saskatchewan Party basically said, we're not touching a thing. In fact, Bill Boyd gave the same speech so many times, I stopped taking notes because it was word for word. Thank you for the jobs. Thank you for the employment. And thank you for investment. We're not touching a damn thing. And when I asked Premier Moe about your book here when it first came out, I said, Mr. Cline's got a book about, potash royalties, and maybe we should change it. And the Premier responded, oh, you mean the royalties that he wrote that we're using?
Mhm.
It's along those lines. So I'm going to open it up to Bronwyn here.
Well, thanks, Brian. I guess, Eric, to start in on the book, tell us, if you would, about the timing, because really, I mean, what Brian has touched on is the timing of any discussion about potash royalties and a royalty review, and timing is everything, and we've seen that. We're loath to go there because the timing never seems right. Clearly, when you wrote the book and what drove you to write the book, and it was released last March, you felt the timing was right. So I guess, why was that?
Well, I think the timing, in fact, is long overdue. In fact, in the 2015 budget, the Saskatchewan Party government itself said there should be a review. And I think it's important to remember that oil and gas is a different subject than potash, in the sense that with oil and gas, you're talking about needing to be competitive with other jurisdictions close to us that are oil and gas producers. And certainly we understood that as government. I understood that. And we tried to level the playing field with Alberta to get oil production up. And of course, Saskatchewan became the largest producer, I think, of conventional oil. We're behind Alberta in terms of gas and heavy oil. But potash is a little bit different because you cannot really economically mine potash in the United States or Manitoba or Saskatchewan or anywhere else really in North America compared to Saskatchewan. So it's a different kettle of fish, and we've always had different sorts of systems. And I would say that the review is overdue because the profits are so high and the tax rate of potash companies is so low. I mean, for example, for marginal effective tax rate, oil and gas companies pay 37%. Potash companies can actually have a negative marginal effective tax rate, pay a lower rate as their profits go up. So we need to adjust that. And of course, that's not just my opinion from somebody who was an NDP politician. It's also the opinion of Jack Mintz, who sat on the board of Imperial Oil and is no social democrat, I don't think, and other people as well. It's when one industry is undertaxed, as potash is, others are overtaxed, because that's just how it works. If some pay not enough, others will pay more. So I think it's long overdue.
So actually, that was at the tail end of the book. You talked quite a bit about that, about how, all the other sectors are paying a lot more correspondingly. And you talked about how the PST was dramatically expanded several years ago, and on everything from children's clothing to different foodstuffs. And the province seemed to be short on money. And one of the things that was really identified in this last provincial election was that 2 things really came to the fore. One is we need to spend more money on healthcare. 2, we need to spend more money on education. And the premier said as much in his acceptance speech, is that he talked about how, we're going to try to find everyone a family physician. Now, I look at that from the oil perspective, and that in part of the interview I did with the premier in October, he talked about wanting to increase oil production, basically doubling it to 1 million barrels a day. And I started doing a series of stories called Reaching for a Million, because where are we going to get the money to pay for the doctors and for the nurses and for all the teachers? You can't easily double production of canola. It's taking 15 years to build the potash mine at BHP. But in reading the book, I really thought a lot about how the way you broke out, especially the windfall stuff, and I'd like to get into this, about how there's a lot of money that's been left on the table that would, as you said in the book, would very much make a difference.
It would make a huge difference. And because, for example, in 2021, the industry had revenue of about 7.5 billion roughly. And in 2022, that went up to 18 billion. They produced the same amount of potash. It was simply a function of a higher world price. And they made $7.2 billion in windfall profit, which is profit which doesn't depend on anything but just a higher price. And the government of Saskatchewan took 1.4 billion, leaving 5.8 billion of a windfall to the companies. And when the price doubled in between those 2 years, of course, it went down afterwards. That price increase should reflect in what the public is paid for its potash, because why wouldn't you sell your potash at a higher price when it has a higher value? And in 2021, the companies paid 19% of their gross revenue in tax and royalties. In 2022, that went down to 16%. It's the only industry where if you make more money, your tax rate will actually go down. And ordinary people don't have that. If I make an extra dollar, I'm probably going to pay a marginal effective tax rate of like 35 cents on that dollar. But potash companies can actually have a negative rate. And why should they be pampered more than mom and pop who run a construction company or own a hotel? And by the way, I don't say that the potash companies should be punished. I believe they should make a very good rate of return. There's no argument about that at all. But that doesn't include giving our potash away. And that is what is bothering me. And in the 15 years that they've been making windfall profits, the provincial debt, I think, tripled, and the sales tax burden on ordinary people and businesses in Saskatchewan doubled. And you have to ask yourself, why are we doing that? Why are we pampering the most lucrative corporations on windfall profits, and yet at the same time doubling the tax burden on ordinary people and businesses in Saskatchewan and increasing the debt? It just doesn't make sense on any analysis, in my view.
There's a lot to unpack there. And before we get to the tax rate thing, because that is its own thing, I think really important to highlight. Just on the volatility of potash, though. I mean, and I remember, Ken Kravetz, before I ran in 2016, I remember where I was when I heard him on the radio say that literally what kept him up at night was the volatility of potash. And the impact of that, potential impact of the lows on the treasury of the province. And I think, a lot of the recommendations that you make in the book are centered around the events of 2022, which, in fairness, were characterized by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's when countries started buying on fear, and prices rose to record highs. So yes, high profits, windfall profits, proverbial windfall profits, a so-called super cycle in terms of potash. But again, we have to admit, and you have to admit, that potash is extremely volatile. Prices have also been at record lows. So I guess, my question is it really fair to focus on the super cycle of 2022 when really it was a once in a decade, maybe even 2 or 3 decades, and flowed from such a dramatic geopolitical event?
Well, I would say this, Bronwyn, the potash prices are volatile, certainly, So are oil and gas prices. I mean, I can remember when they were like $12 a barrel. That was a while ago, mind you, but they're volatile. But nobody is talking about taxing the companies more when profits are low. Nobody's talking about that. What people are talking about is taxing windfall profits. And you're correct that the difference in 22 over 21 was in large measure due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But this started, as I point out in my book, it is not simply a phenomenon from that, because it started in 2008 when the price of potash went from $270 metric ton in 2007, at which point the PCS annual report said that PCS was thriving, to 2008 when the price went to about $740 per metric ton. The profits tripled from 1.5 billion to 4.5 billion. The province, and 3 billion of that was windfall profits in 2008. The province took 1 billion of that, leaving 2 billion on the table for the companies. And it is pretty much continued since 2008, all the way to 2022. 2022 is the most extreme example. But consider that in 2023, the province reports, I think the latest report was about $730 million in taxes and royalties on $4.6 billion of profit. That's the same amount collected in 2018 on 2.5 billion. Like, profits doubled, but the amount that the province took went up by about $14 million. It doesn't make sense. And that's why experts like Jack Mintz and his colleague, Ms. Chen at the University of Calgary have said that it's just a complete mess. And people say, I had a hand in some incentives for the potash industry. That's true. But the circumstances in 2003, which is almost a generation ago now, were not windfall profits. The companies really needed incentive to expand the mines. And those incentives, along with the world market, worked very, very well. But a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. Everything has changed in the potash world, partly because of the Russian invasion, but not entirely. So, and like I say, when prices are low and profits are low, nobody's saying raise the taxes. But when they're high and they're windfall profits, the public deserves to get a fair price for their potash.
So I wanted to maybe step back a little bit here and let people know some of the broader perspective. One of the things you referenced, I lost track of how many times he said it, but basically Saskatchewan is the Saudi Arabia of potash, in that, you know, it's one of the exclusive places where there's a lot of it. I think he said we have enough to supply the world for 1,000 years if we really wanted to. And, you know, can you talk a little bit about that? And before I let you start here, just for everyone who's watching right now, I think we got 75 people right now. If you comment on whatever format you're on, X or LinkedIn or whatever, they'll actually show up here, and I can choose to show those comments maybe a little bit later on. We can interact with some of them. Please be polite, because if you type something rude, it won't be on. Eric.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that motivated me to write the book was that when you are blessed with a resource as unique as the potash resource is to Saskatchewan, it is truly a world-class resource. You should leverage that to the advantage of your jurisdiction, the people in it, the businesses in it. You have proper taxes and proper social programs. And I thought about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as we all know, dominates the world oil market. Saudi Arabia does that with 16% of the world's oil reserves. Saskatchewan has 1/3 of the world's potash reserves, and we have 50% of the reserves in the free world. We also have a stable rule of law jurisdiction. We have the most economically mineable potash. We have the best quality potash. And we should leverage that to our advantage. What we're doing now is shipping all of the profit virtually out of the province to the shareholders who live elsewhere. Norway leverages their oil resource in a different way than Saudi Arabia, but keeping the money in the jurisdiction by owning 70% of the oil extraction business. And, oh, by the way, I should have said Saudi Arabia owns 100% of theirs. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but my point is Norway has $1 trillion sovereignty fund, plus very good social programs. And they do that with less than 1% of the world's oil reserves. They have about 0.5%. So surely there are big things that could be done when we own such a vast and unique potash resource. We should be leveraging it. We should not be doubling the sales tax and going into debt and doubling and tripling our debt at the same time as potash companies are making windfall profits. And when people look at the numbers, and a lot of people have read the book, have said they agreed, including many people that work in senior positions in the potash industry itself, who will not say so publicly, but they know that there's a huge imbalance between what the government is taking and what the case should be. In my opinion, there is no dispute about it. And we should be, whether you're NDP or Sask Party, doesn't matter. We should all agree that the people of the province should get a fair return for their resources, and we're just not doing it. And I hope that the Sask Party government takes the initiative to really help themselves govern the province by getting more money out of the resource, and letting the industry have a very fair return at the same time.
I do think it's important, though, to point out, I mean, what was going on, and just to go back to the volatility point, the timing issue, the super cycle point, because, it's important to think about what was going on in the sector before the super cycle in 2022. So you take, a BHP, and I was part of that. I was part of, trying to nail down its commitment to Jansen, and it was touch and go. There's no question about it. They thought long and hard about committing to that project, and people, make light of that now, and they say, well, it was there, it was in the ground, they built the infrastructure, but there are instances where BHP has walked away from major projects. I think it was a copper mine in Brazil. They could see the hole from space. The global board said wasn't the right time, and they walked away. There was a serious risk of that, which people forget, before BHP committed to what it's now doing, which has been, of course, incredible news for the economy and for the future of the economy in the province. So, they have a very dispassionate global board. And that was the concern, that the global board would not decide to move forward with the project. And luckily they did. But part of that is because of, an investment climate and not too much signaling around, the windfall profits, a conversation. So I think that it's just, I think it's fair to accept that it's a very nuanced, weighing of factors when you talk about royalty revenues and windfall profits. You take a Mosaic, which, before the super cycle of 22, it was investing billions in the new mine shaft at Esterhazy. It had actually idled Kalonze because of eroded demand. And, it ended 2017. It ended 2019 with net losses. And there was water inflow in 2021 in Esterhazy K1 and 2. So, production was lost. A lot of the profits from the super cycle then help pay down debt and pay back investors, coming out of more difficult years. So to go back to your point, Eric, about, the average worker model, I mean, we wouldn't do that to farmers. We wouldn't strangle farmers with higher taxes because they're having a good year after a number of bad years. So I think it's really important to weigh those things when you talk about, the windfall profit scenario and where that leaves everything.
Well, of course, I do weigh those things, Bronwyn. No one is talking about strangling anybody. If you look at the profits that the potash companies are getting and have got since 2008, no one's being strangled here. The fact of the matter is that the PCS annual report for 2007 said that they were thriving when prices were $270 per metric ton. Well, they must have been really thriving in 2008 when the price tripled to $740 a metric ton. And again, I want to say that nobody is saying give the companies a hard time or tax them on profits they don't have. What I'm saying, and I think it's only reasonable, is when they have huge windfall profits, which they do, tax those windfall profits to ensure that people get a fair price for their potash. And I want to say that no one is more in favor of a reasonable rate of return for potash producers than I am. And when I was a minister of the Crown, I brought in more incentives for business and reformed the personal income tax than any minister of the Saskatchewan party government. And I would challenge any minister of that government to challenge that statement, because we did oil and gas royalty change, we did potash change, we did a variety of other changes. And the whole effort, from my point of view, was to incent economic development in this province. And nobody needs to remind me that business needs to make a fair rate of return. I'm all in favor of it. They can make an excellent rate of return, but they cannot have our resource for nothing.
So I wanted to step in here, and there's one part of a book that I think I would consider the most controversial, Eric, and it's where you talk about the theory of economic rent. A lot of the discussion of the book, the whole premise of it is basically that, and you mentioned this in your opening statements, you get to make X amount of money, you get to make decent money, but over and above that, that extra amount, if a whole bunch comes in, you make the point that you think that pretty much all of that should go to the province. And I think that's the most controversial stuff, and we'll get into Bill 42 later. But the idea that you get to make so much money, but no more, and after that, all goes to the province. And province, I mean, some of the examples you gave, theoretically, 1 year we could have got an extra $5 billion, which have paid off a third of our provincial debt in a year. So can you explain the whole idea behind economic rent? What exactly you want for that?
Well, it's actually not my concept, and I note in the book that I don't consider myself to be an expert in resource taxation, and it's for others to really decide the details. I just know that the system, the way we have it now, isn't working, and we need to change it to get a better return. Jack Mintz, who I think is one of the world's leading resource tax economists, proposes the theory of economic rent, which is used in some jurisdictions, that when the world price goes up, as long as the producer is making a fair rate of return, then the excess of price should go to the owner of the resource so that they're paid the adequate price. Now, in terms of that's the theory. I don't necessarily propose that 100% of that increase should go to the public sector. Maybe it should be 80%. I don't know. But right now, about 20% of that is going to the public sector and 80% is being kept by the companies. And I'm saying that is not a correct balance. And so that needs to change. And, I appreciate what Bronwyn is saying, that you have to take, the need to make a return on investment into account, et cetera. I mean, that only makes sense. But I think even Bronwyn would have to say that, we can't say that no matter what happens and no matter how high the profits are, we don't make any change. We surely have to have a look at it, and any sort of tax should be looked at. So I think, Brian, the split of the windfall, that can be looked at. I'm not an expert in saying how exactly the tax and royalty system should be structured. And I say that in the book. In the book, I say that, they should have some kind of independent review of it, but it's within the realm of government to prescribe it as well. But they have to prescribe it not just as dictated by industry, but in a way that objective analysts from the business sector and economists would advise us. And we need to get that advice, because we're really falling behind as a province. We have the highest child poverty rate in the country. We have the highest family poverty rate. We have homelessness. We have needs in the education system. We have big needs in the healthcare system. And we're going into debt like crazy. And why are we doing those things when we could make all of our lives a little bit better and a little bit easier by getting more money out of a world-class, unique resource that is there for us if we do it wisely? And wisely includes taking the needs of business into account, for sure. And as I said,
Eric, I did want to take you to task on that a little bit, because you talk about in the book about in the 1970s in oil related, when the oil crisis hit, and this is a couple of years before I was hatched. But I've talked to a lot of old timers who've told me about it. And the provincial government at the time, the NDP Alan Blakeney government, they formed a crown corporation to take part in the industry, not so much to nationalize all of it, but take part of it. But they also brought in a windfall royalty that I believe ended up being 100% or 101% actually. And I've talked to people who the entire industry just shut down. Oil companies said, we're not paying that. They turned off all their wells for several months. I've talked to a person who worked in a Weyburn unit who, after a few months of this, the provincial government realized, oh, this is not a good idea. And they actually brought an incentive program to keep the service companies working, actually kind of like what happened with COVID. And his job was to go around to a well, turn it on for a day or two, and then turn it off, because every well had to run for 1 day a month just to get production out of it to qualify for this. And it was, I mean, Bill 42 was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court. And I think you soft pedaled this in the book. I really do. But I think that the whole idea of doing the windfall tax, as you suggest, in economic rent, and grabbing the great big chunk of it when windfalls do happen, I think we have evidence 50 years ago that did not work out well in Saskatchewan.
Well, as I say in the book, you can cap. By the way, I wasn't in government in the 1970s, and so I'm not taking responsibility for whatever happened then. But that's a long time ago. But I would say this: let's not forget, first of all, that the response of Premier Blakeney and the NDP in Saskatchewan was the same as the response of Premier Lougheed and the Progressive Conservatives in Alberta. Both governments confiscated what they considered to be windfall profits of the oil and gas sector. There may have been other aspects to it that didn't work out well. I'm not disagreeing about that, but you can cap an oil well if you don't like government policies. You cannot cap a potash mine because the capital expenditure that goes into it is too large. And you're talking about two different resources. Look, I'm saying that you should do things that are going to shut industry down. I'm the last person that would say that. I'm saying that when you have windfall profits, you need to address that. That was addressed by Premier Lougheed. It was addressed by Premier Blakeney, and it needs to be addressed by leaders of Saskatchewan today. And it needs to be addressed now, in my opinion, because it's long overdue. And and BHP, Bronwyn was talking about, and I agree with her that there has to be return. I started meeting with BHP in Melbourne, Australia, at their headquarters there in about the year 2000, and talked to them over the years while the NDP was still in power to try to get them here. And now they are, and I'm glad they are. And they're building, I think, the world's largest mine, and everybody welcomes their investment. So you have to make sure that they get a good return on their investment. But we also have to watch the prices and what the profits are and do what is right for the people of the province.
I think it's fair to say, though, that, and important to remember that we've had two major investments over the course. You plot back to 2008. Since that time, obviously, K+S, which had been driven out 40 years before in 1974, and vowing never to return, came back to the province because of the investment climate, possibly because there was no signaling that we were going to, soberingly, impose a windfall profit, punishment, if you like, on their activities. Similarly with BHP, as I said, very, very touch and go. And now, a major investment in the province, which we've seen since 2008. That just doesn't happen magically. I think it's also important for, everyone to remember how highly taxed potash companies are in Saskatchewan. The potash taxes are multi-layered. The producers pay 10 different taxes. They pay the potash base tax, the profit tax, the resource surcharge tax, provincial and federal income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, and of course the carbon tax. And, taxes here in Saskatchewan are already among the highest in the world. No question about that. No other mining jurisdiction, certainly among our primary competitors. So Russia, China, Belarus, pay anything close, and they have much less regulation, lower cost labor, and lower taxes. And Eric, you mentioned the marginal tax rate, and you rely on that at several points in the book. I mean, of course, that only applies to the last dollars earned, whereas on the effective tax rate, which is the average tax paid on all revenue in a year, Saskatchewan's at 44%. So I think that's also important context. I mean, given all that, and the tax reality and the volatility, and we've talked a bit about that. I mean, what companies dealt with on both sides of the super cycle. Wouldn't your message of taxing windfall profits be a disincentive to investment?
No, I don't agree with the premise of your question that the taxes in Saskatchewan are outrageously high. I think in my book I quote some figures from Mintz and Chan, where they compare, taxes of potash companies in Saskatchewan and other jurisdictions. I don't think they're out of line. And also, when you tax according to the resource you have, and I do not believe that the taxes that Saskatchewan potash companies are paying are at all out of line. And when you're talking about marginal effective tax rate, Bronwyn, don't forget. Yes, it applies to the next dollar, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about taxing windfall profits. We're talking about taxing money that is made because the world price goes up. Therefore, the companies make more without any additional production, without any additional investment. So it's not a return on investment question, and without any risk taking. And when the world price goes up so that commodity is worth more, the people of the province should benefit from that. And we're not getting the benefit we should. And, I just don't think it's correct to say we never will change anything, no matter how high the price is. I mean, if the price went permanently to $1,300 a ton, surely, Bronwyn, you wouldn't say that we shouldn't look at taxing the companies more, when actually the rate of tax they're paying is quite low on the dollars they're making. There has to be room for change. There has to be, in responsible government, the ability to review the tax situation, whether it's my income tax, the sales tax. And I guess what I would say is when my income goes up, my tax rate goes up. When other industries, their income goes up, their tax rate goes up. And when the income of potash companies goes up, their tax rate should go up. The same rules should apply to them as everybody else. And I don't know why these companies that I have nothing against, they should make a fair rate of return, but why we pamper them, but we don't pamper the construction company owned by Ma and Pa, or the trucking company owned by Joe Blow. They don't get treated like that. And I don't see why the potash companies, which are the richest corporations operating in the province, should. It's imbalanced.
So I'm just going to interject here for a minute. We need to go to an ad from our sponsor, which pays for this. This is going absolutely spectacular. We've got well over 100 people watching. People, you can make comments and we can interact with them. There's a few things I do want to get to here before we wrap up, because we're going to burn through an hour real quick. So we'll be right back here in 30 seconds. All right, so we're back here, and I wanted to, one of the reasons I want to talk about potash here is, again, I write mostly about oil and gas, as you see the pump check behind us here, is that, one of the things I want to know is, can we ever change royalty structures ever? So I actually, I asked Premier Moe about this during my year-end interview. I'm just going to play a short little clip, and I want you guys to tell me if you think he actually answered my question. So just 1 second to tee that up here. So the election saw both parties speak about the importance of maintaining royalties. Basically, it didn't come up except for me asking about it. Is there ever a time for any commodity, being it oil, uranium, potash, lithium, or helium, where a government can reconsider royalties without serious repercussions? And where I'm going with that is that in 2009, the Stelmach government in Alberta talked seriously about a royalty review. Yeah. And I wrote 6 months of stories, what I called Refugees from Stelmach.
Yeah. And there's a history in that very accurate article, and I glanced at it not too long ago, actually. I think we need to be aware in that vein of being aware of what your allies, who are also sometimes your competitors for investment attraction and whatnot, be aware of what they're up to and what they're doing. Also understanding geology in Saskatchewan is slightly different than Alberta, and maybe slightly different than looking to the south, and the South Dakota North Dakota and Montana oil fields of which we share. And I think we have often looked to compare ourselves to, some of the Alberta regulatory environment and royalty environment. Maybe what we should do is, take a page out of Doug Burgum's book, and maybe look a little more closely to the south. And maybe this is an opportunity for us, maybe coinciding with the federal election, to look at how they have went from roughly about the same amount of barrels that we produce in Saskatchewan in North Dakota to something north of 2 million.
I think it was they went from 90,000 to 1.2 million in the space of 4 years.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Brian.
Yeah, Brian, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I hit the cough button here. So did he actually answer my question? And is there ever a good time to adjust royalties? Because as I said in the opening, the Saskatchewan Party has been in power for 16, 17 years now, and they basically haven't touched a damn thing since you were in power, except for the multilateral program.
Well, in fairness to Premier Moe, I would say he's not the first politician that has dodged a question, and I've done it many times myself, I'm sure, but you won't let me get away with that. But, I think that there always has to be an ongoing review. It doesn't mean that you change things in an unstable way or in a volatile way. But of course, you have to look at how your systems are working, and you have to adjust them. You do it in consultation with the industry, you do it in consultation with the public, and you do it with an eye to seeing how it's going to affect investment in the province, for sure. All of those things can be done. And there are ways even to account for volatility, and Jack talks about them. Again, in anything that is done, it should not be done in such a way that it shocks investors or scares them away. But it does not mean that you are only dictated to by the industry and that you never change anything no matter what happens. And in my view, so much has happened and been left on the table that something has to be done. And that's a view that I have. And my background is as a social democrat, but it's also a view that many people of a conservative nature have. And I've had lots of business people in the province picking up my book and buying extra copies of my book and sharing it with people in business who also agree that something needs to be done. They're not treated this way in their businesses, and they feel that it's unfair that no action is ever taken with the potash profits, no matter how high they are. So we need to make a change.
Well, a couple of things on that. I mean, I guess I would say, to the point we haven't touched anything, of course, and I'll get to that in a second. Of course, we have, let's not forget again, attracted these two major investments into the sector and into the province. I mean, K+S, which ran away 40 years ago, and BHP, which was touch and go, and we've talked about that. So that's huge in terms of future profit and tax generation, in the province for everyone. It's no accident, and it's not to be underestimated. I mean, I'm well acquainted with Jack Mintz's views on this, and I've read them through the years as well. I mean, I think that the whole thing about, you have to be careful, or it could detract from investment, but it still needs to be fixed, is a very complex proposition. And I guess to a certain extent, everyone should be sort of careful what they wish for, because it's easy to say and less easy to do. And that includes, what Jack Mintz has talked about. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the royalty regime in Saskatchewan is a crazy patchwork, certainly, which he has said, but it does work. And we did make a change in 2019. We scrapped the base payment credit, and certainly, Nutrien at that time and Mosaic were not happy about that. It took a while to calm the waters. The impacts on them were 40 and I believe 50 million respectively. And they were very public about that. And one of the things that came up as a result of that was, that the whiff of uncertainty, would detract from investment. You can debate that, and I understand that is worthy of debate, whether if you signal change, you actually impact investment or not. But the point is, they certainly said it would and could, and that it was, even that moderately small, change, which, as I say, we did make in 19 to really simplify the tax deductions, to make sure that Saskatchewan people received fair value from the flat base payment rate on potash production, which had become eroded by deductions over the years, and really those effective average tax rates had fluctuated wildly. So it was to reestablish some basis of stability. They were, anywhere up to 18%, and making the change we did sort of restored that balance, brought the effective tax rate, average closer to 9. But as I say, it was not without drama. And so I think when we say, well, it's very complex and we have to fix it, that is a very, very delicate task, and could well impact on future investment. I mean, any whiff of going after windfall profits will do that. And I think the companies, it would be interesting to hear from some of them now, whether they feel that the sort of subtle balance that we've achieved could be easily thrown off by, that kind of talk. And I mean, even to your point, Eric, about, Saudi Arabia, it's a lot easier to produce oil in Saudi Arabia. It fairly springs out of the ground. Whereas, the capital investment, the massive capital investment of a potash mine is not to be underestimated when it comes to stability and really what they're in for. A company such as BHP making that decision when they did, they wanted stability. And
I want to actually shift gears here a little bit, because it's related directly to what both of you have just said about making investment into new projects and whatnot. I've written over 30 stories in my Lithium in Saskatchewan series, and we are on the verge of a brand new industry in this province. And it's very interesting because it's related almost entirely on oil and gas production companies and facilities, and it's indistinguishable basically from drilling oil wells, but that's the lithium industry. But they're going to do it on a tax regime which is based on the potash industry. And if I remember correctly, I think the royalty rate established is something like 4.5%. It's either 3% or 4%. Let's call it 4.5%. So I'm projecting by 2030, we're going to have a multi-billion-dollar lithium industry here. If everything goes according to plan, first commercial production should happen at the end of this year with Arizona Lithium, and it's just going to grow from there. There's multiple companies doing it. It's a totally new industry. So we get to establish the table stakes for everyone instead of getting all the stuff where you're dealing going back, we say 40, 50 years, whatever. And if we have $1 billion in revenue at 4.5%, we're only getting 45 million. As Bronwyn just mentioned, the companies were walking about 40 million. We can't build a high school for 45 million on $1 billion of royalties. So Eric, what do you think about that? And Bronwyn, you're next.
Well, I think that, you have to look at each commodity separately. For example, to Bronwyn's point about, industry has to make money, obviously. It was sodium sulfate. When I was Minister of either Finance or Industry and Resources, we had to, virtually eliminate taxation on sodium sulfate or some kind of tax we had, because otherwise they couldn't operate. And I don't know what the rate should be on lithium, but it should be a balanced approach. You always need balance between the needs of the public sector and the government to pay for health and education and keep taxes for others reasonable, and the needs of industry to make a profit. And I would suggest that that balance requires government not just to take into account the needs and veiled threats of any particular industry, but also the other taxpayers, the education system, the healthcare system, the rate of poverty, and so on, all of those factors. And we cannot operate in a climate of fear where we're afraid of what industry may do. We have to be fair and make sure that everybody gets a fair return, but we must not operate in a climate of fear. Leadership requires courage. courage requires knowledge and fairness, and having an appropriate dialogue with industry. And I disagree with Bronwyn in her suggestion that we have achieved a balance. I think that it is grossly unbalanced, and we'll have to agree to disagree on that. But I do think whether it's lithium or potash or any other sector, we need to do what is fair, and it needs to speak to the needs of that particular industry. The needs of potash may not be the same as the needs of the lithium people, just like sodium sulfate is different and oil and gas is different, and so on.
Well, I think we have to live in a climate of reality. And I think the climate of reality around potash is its volatility. And the climate of reality around mining is rife with examples of idled mines, mines that go dormant and are brought back. And we certainly see that, in potash, and I've mentioned some of the examples. We've also seen an enormous amount of, let's call it goodwill, when it comes to investment. The investment has been massive, and that is, of course, a risk that private companies undertake when they decide to go down that road. I think that the two words, windfall profits, and the taxing of windfall profits and such talk would by its very nature create a very sobering effect. I think we've seen that. And Brian, you've talked about, the nationalization efforts that we've seen in the past in this province. I mean, K+S, is a very good example, because when they reopened and came back after 40 years to Saskatchewan in 2014, one of the things that the CEO said is, we are no longer looking back in anger. And that looking back in anger was to when they were driven out. And the reason they were driven out is because of nationalization policies. So I think one has to be extremely careful about leaving the implication out there that there is always in a state of windfall profits, and that there haven't been intense down years, really just over the last few years. And I've mentioned some of those on either side of the super cycle that we saw in 2022. And so I think that it's, it would impact investment, is my position.
The difficulty I have, Bronwyn, with your position, and I've conceded that you have to take the interests of business largely into account, is intransigence. Because what you are essentially saying, and I've invited you to acknowledge that there may be certain times when there is a need for change. And what you are basically saying is that it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, what the profits are, what the world price is, there isn't going to be any change. And I just don't think that that's a responsible position. With respect, I'm sorry, but you have to acknowledge that there may be some levels of profit, and we've seen some of them, where some change is needed. And I've repeatedly said that, yes, the resource sector is volatile. That does not mean that you do not look at windfall profits. You're muted, Brian.
You're on mute, Brian, and my telephone rang. So
sorry about that. Well, it's the first time out doing it, so I'll get better. I have something from both your points. And I think this is a pretty good example of, should we change anything and whatnot? One of the long-standing things, and I believe this was brought in under your regime, Eric, is the horizontal drilling program, or not horizontal, a multilateral program, but the incentive for horizontal drilling. Now,
Right.
when I first started doing pipeline news, at that time, back in 2008, the press releases were always, well, we've drilled X amount of wells and 40% of them are horizontal. Woohoo! We drilled 40% horizontal wells. The next year is 47%. The next year is, and now for the last 15 years, 12 years, about 98% of wells drilled are horizontal. If you're not drilling horizontal, you're either doing a core, you're doing something special, but no one, generally speaking, drills vertical wells. So why do we still have a horizontal well incentive? And I know there are some people in Calgary might be watching this that want to string me up for even mentioning this, but I think it's a legitimate question. Why do we have an incentive to do what is the industry norm, and it's not going to change?
I'm not sure, but what I would say is this: it's wonderful that the technology is developed to get more oil out of our, sedimentary rock or whatever you call it, because think of the environmental benefit of using infrastructure that's been put there for horizontal drilling. And I know that the industry is very innovative, and a lot of work has been done by PTRC and Regina, among others, to try to get more oil out. And I guess I would say that if it's not broke, don't fix it. I mean, you've got the incentives the way they are. The industry say that it works. We've got good oil production in Saskatchewan, and I don't allege that the oil industry makes too much money in Saskatchewan. I think it's fairly reasonable. So if it's not broke, don't fix it, I would say, and it seems to be going well.
Same goes for the royalty regime. I mean, I think one thing that and you know, again, I think that there are conversations one could have. I just don't think that they should be led under the guise of the windfall profits, you know, moniker. I mean, I think one of the things that I found frustrating, even when we were considering in 2019 changing the base payment credit, was this perception, and it included, you know, both sides, as it were, that somehow, because potash is a captive product here in Saskatchewan, and it's never going to go anywhere, companies won't either. And I think that really has been proven to be incorrect when you look at, you know, again, the K+S example, and the mammoth investment that's required for some of these projects, and the competitors we face. I mean, potash is global. It is not localized. I mean, we're responsible for some 40% of global production, and so is, you know, so are Russia, Belarus, and China, and to some degree Australia. I mean, it is a global commodity. It is based on global pricing, and it is something that is very delicate. And I think that that's, you know, an important context.
I think, folks, here, we're getting really close to the hour, and I do want to wrap things up. But honestly, we could go for hours. And
No kidding.
you know, this is an awesome discussion. You know, having people on both sides. You know, two energy ministers lined up like this. I mean, you know, one guy brought in the thing, so the other one had the option to change it. And you know, I mean, this is the sort of stuff that I want to do, is have, you know, in-depth discussions in this. People actually know what they're talking about. And I think this has been a great one to kick off on here. Eric, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
No, I think I'd like to say thank you for having me. I think it's good that you two are doing these podcasts, and hopefully it is interesting. I think it's good that you have different points of view. As Bronwyn and I obviously have somewhat different points of view, but I respect that, you know, I respect that we can have different points of view. And I think that I guess I would just say we need balance. We need everybody's interest to be considered, including industry, including the public sector, including the programs and so on, and the tax that other people pay. And hopefully it will be looked at, and we'll find a better solution than we have right now. And I thank you.
I think that this is going to be one of the things I do want to do with this podcast, is that I do want to have, you know, different points of view. I do want to have real animated discussions, because as I mentioned earlier, if you agree with me 100%, one of us is crazy. And, you know, this is one of the things that we need, some open discussion in Saskatchewan Energy. There is no one else focusing on the energy sector or the mineral sector like Pipeline Online is in this province. And I think that this is a place where people can come and pay attention. We've got at 138 people viewing our first episode live. And that's not counting the ones that are going to see it on the repeat. So this will be available on all your different podcast apps. I need to upload it to that. You'll be able to subscribe to it on a regular basis. Is there Eric? I'm just going to keep your phone on there so we can download your thing. So don't turn it off yet. Oh,
yeah,
here's
he
the
has
book.
to show his book. I have to show his art.
Hey, where did you get the book? And show me the art.
That's his glass. I have it in my house.
Oh.
I bought Eric's work.
Show the glass here. All right. So Eric, where can you get that book?
Well, you can get it at McNally Robinson. You can also get it online from Amazon. You can get an ebook version from Amazon and others. And hopefully all the bookstores in Regina and Saskatoon at least. But if you go online, certainly you can get it from Amazon, and you can get it in ebook mode if you like.
So one last thing is that viewers, you can comment. It does work. We've had a few comments come in. Ryan Dion said that the Premier did not answer my question. So just to show it, this actually does work here. Come back here. There we go. So in the future, if you want to interact, when we get a host on or a guest here that you might have a few questions for, please do take part. Bronwyn and I plan on doing this about twice a month. It's not necessarily going to be a regular schedule, but hopefully, usually every second Monday, give or take. We've got Jeremy Harrison coming up here. We're supposed to be talking to him on Friday, and it's going to be actually pretty big because Jeremy was in Estevan last week and Cornac the day before that, telling coal workers that guess what? We're not planning on turning off the coal power plants. We're actually looking at rebuilding them, which is one of the biggest shifts in policy we've seen in almost a generation. It's been, the death of coal has been coming here ever since the last 10, 15 years almost. And now the provincial government's looking to change it. So we'll be talking to Crown Investments Minister Jeremy Harrison later in the week. And I think that's a wrap.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and good luck in your next endeavors, including this one. And I appreciate your public service.
Likewise.
Thank you. And there will be a series of stories on Eric's book coming out in the next week or two here. There's going to be a lot if you want to dig into it, but I do encourage you to buy the book. Thank you very much, folks. Bye.